Good morning. We do have a number that are visiting with us. We are very thankful that you are here. I ask you to open up your Bibles to Matthew the 23rd chapter is where we're going to begin in just a minute. I think we could all say that this past year has been interesting. There's no question, at least in my lifetime, I never thought I would hear people argue about masks and passionately argue about them. It is truly amazing how angry people can get over everything or anything. And yet, we're talking about from a physical perspective of wearing a mask is one thing. The danger is people do not take off their spiritual mask. And that's what I want to talk about today. The idea of what this looks like from our faith. Do we truly have unmasked faith? Or are we striving to make it look like we do on the outside when we really are struggling and need help? In Matthew the 23rd chapter, we see the Pharisees and the scribes are being talked to or spoken of about by Jesus. And he's talking to the crowd, and he begins in verse 1, and he says, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you, do and comply with it all. But do not do as they do, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them so as much as their finger. And they do all their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments, and they love the place of honor at banquets and the seats of honor in the synagogues and personal greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by the people." Let's stop there. They looked the part, didn't they? Verse 1, as we talked about in class, they sat themselves on Moses' seat, or on the seat of Moses. God sat Moses on that seat. The Pharisees, it says, they sat themselves there. They decided that they were going to be the ones in charge. He goes on in verse 3, and he tells them, look, they may say the right things, but they certainly do not do them. They're not doing the things that they need to be doing. They tell other people to carry these big burdens, and they won't even lift their own finger. They look the part. Jesus goes on and tells them, verse 13 and following, that they were nothing but hypocrites. He tells them that they were blind guides in verse 16. You continue on in verse 24. He says, "You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of a cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but on the inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to people, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." That's powerful words to be said to someone or about someone. The danger is, what if it's us? What if this describes us? You ever gone to a restaurant and they have like a little speck of something on the inside of your glass, and you're just so highly offended that there's this little speck that I need a new glass. I can't even believe you brought me this glass. It's so dirty. But spiritually, the outward looks fine, and the inward, you can have a little dirt, and it's no big deal. We would never do that physically. Most of us would never do that physically. But spiritually, it's the danger. They look so nice on the outside. Inwardly, they were dirty, as it says. Verse 26, again, you have to clean the inside of the cup. Verse 27, you're nothing but a whitewashed tomb. You look good on the outside. Inside, though, you're full of dead men's bones. Powerful words. And we understand this from the big picture about being a hypocrite. Looking the part, but not actually acting the part. Doing what you want to do. And there's a tremendous danger of that. And there's no question about that. But the difficulty for us sometimes is when we're actually hiding the pain and the agony and the struggles. Not trying to just show somebody that we are self-righteous, but we're so afraid to show our true selves. our true issues. So on the outside, we can pretend like we're not struggling with anything. We don't lie. We're not trustworthy, as the picture shows. But the reality is, the truth, we struggle. And we need help. So we can keep a mask on that makes us look like we're doing the right thing from the perspective of wanting people to see us and look how great I am. But we also can do it because we suffer and we're ashamed. That's what I want to talk about this morning. There are people that are suffering. There are people that are struggling. And the danger so often is we walk in with our masks on so people will never see it and never be able to help us. If you turn over to James, the first chapter, James talks of this. When you compare it to the discussion of the Pharisees, I think we can understand this from our perspective. Verse 21 beginning, he says, "Therefore, ridding yourselves of all filthiness and all the remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves. If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in the mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten the kind of person he was. But one who has looked intently at the perfect law and the law of freedom and has continued in it, not having become a forgetful hearer but an active doer, this person will be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks himself to be religious but does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this person's religion is worthless." I'm going to stop there. I want you to think about verse 22 for a minute. The question is not whether or not you've heard it. The question is, are you doing it? And one of the biggest things that you'll find in the scriptures is when he says you deceive yourself. What a scary thing that is. I hear it and I'm doing it. Are you? Are you really living it? Have we truly allowed it to set us free? Are we willing to allow people to truly see who we are and what we struggle with and ask for help? Are we really willing for people to see who we truly are? Do we hear the words of God and pretend like we're doing those things? And so there's application across the board, depending on where you are. The reality is, it depends on, as you go forward in verse 26, what you're doing. What your religion is. And religion, by the way, here is what word the Bible uses. Religion is. Is it worthless or is it correct? That's the choice that you and I have. That's the choice of what we show based on our actions. You know, it's interesting to me, I'm not going to turn here, but in Exodus, the 24th chapter, verses 1 through 7, Nadab and Abihu and Aaron and the elders were there, and all the people were standing there with Moses. Exodus 24, and they're standing there, and Moses is telling them, this is what you need to do. You cannot, don't touch the mountain, don't go close to it, you need to do these things. And all the people said, yes, we'll do that. We're going to do it. We're going to obey God. You know what happens a couple chapters later? They're worshiping a golden calf. A little while later, Nadab and Abihu are killed for offering strange fire, it says. We're going to do exactly what God says, and people do this all the time. We'll say the right things. We'll say it. I love him. I'm going to do exactly what he tells me to do. And then all of a sudden, we're worshiping a golden calf or doing things that we're not intended to do. Over in 1 John, we talked about this in class, but I think this is so powerful. In 1 John, the first chapter, he talks about really the stages as we talked about in class. Verse 6, he says, look, you're going to say that you walk in light. You're going to tell other people that you're a child of God. People are going to see it. You're going to show it. You're going to talk about it. So much so in verse 8, he says, you're going to start believing it yourself. You're going to start lying to yourself. You're going to deceive yourself. And then you're going to become so good at it in verse 10, you're going to try to lie to God. You're going to try to lie to him. And people are caught in this cycle. Then he goes on into chapter 2. He talks about the advocate. He talks about all the things we talked about in verse 6. He talks about that we need to walk just as he did. We need to remain in him or abide in him. And we're all, yes, that's exactly the things that we do. And then you come to verse 8, and on the other hand, I am writing a new commandment to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Wait a minute. We've heard it. You've heard me talk about this verse all the time. Doing it, though, is another conversation. How many of us focus so much on the darkness that's passing away rather than the light? The world is so dark. Yes, I know, I just read it. Right? Why do we have to tell everybody that? It's the light they need to see. It's the light we need to talk about. One of the things that amazes me as a parent in 2021 is how many older folks talk about how nice it was in the old days. What's that do for me and my children? Well, how does that help anybody? What example is that? You can focus on the good old days, you can focus on the darkness, but I'm telling you, as God's children, we are to focus on the light. We are to see him. I can hear it. We've heard it. You just heard it. Doing it is the key. It's not being ignorant of the things that are going on in this world. It's dark. It's sinful. We know that. It's having confidence in God. He goes on, and he talks about in verse 15, do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. We've heard it. Do we follow it? Do not love the world. That's a pretty good place. And it is. But if we're putting it before God, and the things that are passing away, as verse 17 says, and his will not pass away, we're focusing on the wrong thing. Do not love the world. We'll talk about it. Do we do it? Do we live it? Or are we very similar to the Pharisees? That we just look the part and actually don't live the part. I want you to think about this quote with me for just a minute. Stop lying to yourself, swallowing the poisonous self-deceptions that keep you from experiencing healthy spiritual growth. Admit the truth, come clean. If you are willing, the truth will set you free. It's a nice quote. But what does that look like? Stop admitting like there's nothing that you're struggling with. Or stop pretending that there's nothing that you're struggling with. Admit that there is. And I don't stand before you as somebody that's perfect. I struggle. Physically, I struggle. And it causes me to struggle emotionally. I'm no different than anybody else. And so I'm not standing up here trying to tell other people what you need to do. I'm talking to myself. We've got to understand that we all struggle, that we all have the same Father, or striving to have the same Father, and we can actually help one another get there. We can lean on one another. The danger is we're so concerned that somebody's going to judge us harshly. Guess what? That's their problem. That's their struggle that God will take care of. We need to start admitting the truth. It is dangerous how often we deceive ourselves. And the Scripture's use of deceiving is so important. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. You know why that's in there? Because we think we can do it. I can hang out with whoever I want. I'm not going to fall. Oh, he says, do not be deceived. Do you know why? Because I'm always deceived by that. I think I can. Do not just be a hearer, but a doer. Don't deceive yourself into thinking that you're doing it. Actually live it. Stop deceiving yourselves. So I want you to think about this for a minute. Do you really trust God? Do you really trust him? Everybody's going to say, oh, of course I trust God. Do you really trust him? In your life, do we really show that we trust him? And the things that you go through, do you really trust him? Do I really trust him? One of the hardest things when it comes to trust to me, when it comes to God and for me personally, is that I don't have control of how I'm going to get there. I have a plan. And I think I know what's going to happen. But believe it or not, a pandemic was not part of my plan. And making those goofball seating charts every week for a year was not my plan. But God said, that's what's going to happen. And that's what happens. And what do? I trust him. I'm going to worship him. I'm going to keep growing as I should, and you should. And my plans might be different. And I don't understand why I go through certain things that I go through, or you go through certain things that you go through, but I trust the one who knows. Or do I? Easy to say. Do you trust him? If we trust him, why do we worry about so many things? Are you struggling with something? Do we struggle? Do you struggle with how the world is right now, our country is right now? We struggle with it. It becomes our priority. It's your idol, is what it is. We struggle so mightily with something that's all we ever think about, rather than thinking about the light, our God. Do you struggle with something? Do we try to pretend like we don't? That there's nothing that we struggle with? Do we try to pretend that there's things that I'm doing that are from a sinful standpoint, but I'm not addicted to them? I can stop at any time. That is the greatest line an addict will say. I can stop at any time. Then stop. You deceive yourself into thinking you're able to do something you cannot do by yourself. You've got to be willing to accept the fact that you need help. That there's things that we go through that we need help. We cannot be so embarrassed with what we struggle with that we're afraid to ask for help. Do you need help? Isn't it fascinating, besides the fact this is probably the spit zone up here in the front two rows, or front rows up here, that nobody sits here? This is Sinner's Row. Because in a minute the preacher's going to say, come forward. We all should be sitting on the front row. We're all in need of help. We're all striving through this life and struggling through various things at various times in our lives. When somebody comes forward, it's just a plea to know that the people around me can help me. And I need your help. That's why I always talk about make sure you're praying for one another. Because even in situations where people are afraid to ask for help, God knows they need help. And I still can take their names before him. I love this picture because I'm afraid this has described me in my past, and it may describe you today. You can look the part. You can look the part. You can fool man. And the scariest thing is you can fool yourself. But God knows who we truly are. And in his wisdom, he has set you up with people around you that are in fellowship with him, as you talked about in 1 John class, that want nothing more than for you to have a relationship with God. And if I can help you do that, that's all I want, is the opportunity to help. It's time to stop lying to ourselves, or stop pretending that everything is fine, or stop letting people think that everything is fine, and actually let people help you. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, that's where you start. Your relationship with God, I would love to introduce you to him. The God of all comfort, the God that wants you to be with him for eternity, to be a part of his family, a part of his church, to be able to help one another get through this life. Because, listen, this world is dark. Without God, we have no chance of defeating this world. Think about that. Not one single chance. With God, we have no chance of losing. Not because of you. It's because of our God. Have a relationship with Him. Spiritually, are you ready to take the mask off? That's my question for you today. Make sure that you're praying for one another. If you need help, ask for help. There are people here that have gone through things in their past that are more than willing to help you that are going through it. One of the things that Satan does very, very well is to make you think you're the only one going through something. And that is absolutely false. You are not the only one going through something. You're not the only one struggling. Make sure that you know who He is and that you have a relationship with Him. And let us help you if you need it. If there's anything that we can do for you right now, I ask you to please come as we stand and sing.